Simon. Here's Simon. Great. Right. Okay. We are on Membet Amidbet 42B. We'll start 42B, 42B1, top of the page. Really, we could go back to 42A3 and start the Mishnah. Start from the bottom, one line. 42, the last line of 42A3. You have a frying pan or you have a pot that were removed from the fire when they were boiling. And they're still boiling. Okay? So they're off the fire, Simon, and it's still boiling. What status does that pot have? Does that pot still have the ability to cook? It's no longer on the fire, but it's still boiling hot. If you put your finger there, you would have to move your finger back because it will recoil. It's too hot to keep your finger there. So the Mishnah teaches us, lo yitin l'tocho tavlin. At that point, it still has the ability to cook, and you can't place spices raw. You can't place raw spices into that pot because you will be cooking the raw spices. Now we turn the page, 42B1. But if you poured the contents of the frying pan or the pot into a bowl or into a large bowl, like where you empty the whole contents of the pot into that large bowl, that becomes a kli sheni. Because it's a kli sheni will not cook. So then, once you pour the contents of the pot, of the frying pan or the pot into a bowl, then you could put the spices into that bowl. Right? That's what we said yesterday. And we said yesterday that this is one of the three things that we find that a kli sheni, a second vessel, will not cook. There are three things that we know for sure that a second utensil won't cook. We said oil, said water, and now we're saying spices. We said there are other foods that if it's in a kli sheni, the kli sheni has the ability to cook. If it's, let's say, foods that require very little cooking, called kalei habishel. Kalei habishel. My phone was on, the volume was on, that's why I lowered it. Turned it off. That's called kalei habishel. That's called things that are easy to be cooked. So those things we said you cannot place into the kli sheni, right? We said the Mishnah states that you could place spices into the bowl, even though the bowl is still boiling. You could put spices in it. Spices won't cook in that bowl. But other types of food we said might cook in that bowl. Like we gave the example. Let's say, what about a tea bag? Right? If you pour the hot soup into the bowl, can you put the tea bag into that bowl? So we said no, because maybe the tea bag might be easy to cook. And therefore might be something that's easy to cook. If it's easy to cook, it might even cook in the bowl, which is the kli sheni, which is the second vessel. And therefore, in order for you to put the tea bag in, tea bag is raw leaves, you have to pour from the bowl into another bowl. Therefore, that will make the second bowl will be a kli shlishi. The pot itself would be a kli rishon, the first utensil. The first bowl is the second utensil. The second bowl is the third utensil. And then you can put we said you can put the tea bag into that. Is that what we said, Anna? Tell me if I'm saying correct. That's what our Mishnah tells us. The kli sheni, you can place the spices into kli sheni. Yehuda says, La kol notain. You can add spices to anything. We'll have to see what that means. What does that mean? We'll see it soon. Chutz medavar sheyesh bo chometz v'tzir. If the pot that you're putting the spices into has within it vinegar, or the pot that you're pouring the spices into has in it brine, let's say brine from the fish, brine from the fish. These are acidic substances. So these type of substances, the brine or the vinegar, and help the hot water to cook faster. Now, meaning to say, if you would place it, if there wouldn't be any spices or vinegar, just regular water, right? Then there'll be a certain halacha. But now that you have in the mix, not just water, you have vinegar or fish brine mixed in. So now if you put the spices into that, the coming together of the vinegar or the fish brine being in that pot, being in that bowl, or what, we'll see where it is. If you're pouring the spices into that, that will enable it to cook faster. Is that clear? If you don't have vinegar, you don't have fish brine in that pot, it won't cook faster. It won't fasten the process. Having that in will fasten the process. Now the Gemara is going to ask. Look what the Gemara will jump right to the Gemara. Iboilu. In the yeshiva, they asked the following question. They wanted to understand this statement that was stated in the Mishnah by Rabbi Yehuda. Yehuda makes the statement that, you know what, you could put into any you can add spices to anything except if it has vinegar or brine. Does that mean he holds you can add spices even to the pot that you moved off the fire and it's still boiling, the original Kli Rishon? Would he allow you to put spices in a pot? Let's say that once the pot is off the fire, he holds it's not a problem of cooking, even if it's boiling. Or is he saying, and therefore he would be very lenient opinion? Because until now, at least the first opinion of the Mishnah states, if you remove the spice, if you remove the pot, the boiling hot liquid from the fire, you said you can't put spices into that pot because you're putting spices in the original utensil. But you could put spices in a second utensil. Does Rabbi Yehuda hold you could even put spices in the first utensil, even to the original pot that was cooked, as long as the pot's off the fire? Or is Rabbi Yehuda more strict, that he says you could only put it in the second utensil? You can only put it, and he says you could put it in a second utensil, provided that the second utensil doesn't have brine or vinegar. But if the second utensil has brine or vinegar, you can't even put it in there, the spices. That's the question. What does Rabbi Yehuda mean, l'kolu notein? Does it mean you can even put spices into a pot that's off the fire, that's the original pot? Or you can only put it into a second pot when it doesn't have the spices in the brine? That's the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda, Aresha Kai, is he going on the Resha? Is he going on the first case of the Mishnah? That the Mishnah stated that at the original pot, the Tanakama says you can't put spices into the original pot if it's off the fire. And Yehuda says, no, you can put it in the original pot as long as it doesn't have the brine. Odil Kula, he's being lenient. Odilma Seifa Kai, or is he going on the second case of the Mishnah? That the allowance of a second utensil, he's only going to allow it if it doesn't have the brine or the vinegar. But if the brine or the vinegar, there'll be a problem. Meaning the first opinion in the Mishnah did not mention anything about brine or vinegar in the mix, right? The first opinion says it's all dependent. Is the pot, are you putting the spice in the original pot that was cooked? The original pot that was cooked, it's off the fire now, it's on the counter? or you're putting it in the bowl. I mean, you pour the contents of the pot in the bowl, and now you're putting the spice in the bowl. The first opinion just says it's all that it depends. You can't put the spice in the original pot that you cooked in, but you can put the spice in the bowl that you pour the contents of the pot into. That's it. And it doesn't make a distinction whether there's brine in that bowl, no brine in the bowl. Doesn't make a difference. Doesn't make a difference. Brine in the original pot, no brine in the original pot. But Rabbi Yehuda makes a difference. But where is Rabbi Yehuda talking? That's the Gemara's question. Well, Duma a sefer koyel chumra. Is he going on the sefer and he's being strict? That he's saying that the kli sheni placing into the bowl would only be good if there's no brine or vinegar. Tashma. The Gemara says, come in here. We're going to prove it. We're going to answer the question. The Tanya, we looked at the Breita. Rabbi Yehuda says, l'chol ufasim. All pans you could put into the original pot. Hu notein. You could put it to the original pan. Obviously, the pan is off the fire. All pots that are boiling, you could put the spices into. If that clearly shown, if that original pot has vinegar or fish brine, then you can't put the spices in there. But if it doesn't have fish brine or vinegar, you can even put the spices in the original pot that's boiling. And Tosfos points out this allowance that you could put spices into the original pot that the food was cooked, as long as it's off the fire, it's only which is a kli rishon, which is we're actually putting spices into a kli rishon to the first utensil. That means the one that the food was cooked into. This allowance is only by spices. But other foods, he agrees that it will be cooked even when it's off the fire. He holds spices are very sharp, right? It's very strong. You want to cook a spice, you need a lot to cook a spice. It takes a lot of strength. And therefore, he's very lenient, the kula. He holds if it's not on the fire, if the pot is off the fire, the spice, and you put the spice into that boiling pot that's hot, it won't cook the spice. You need to be on the fire, cook that spice. But other foods, he would agree, you can't put it into that pot. It would cook if it's not on the fire, if it's boiling hot, if it's the original pot that, remember we said, the original pot that the food was cooked in retains its heat much more than a secondary pot that was never cooked in, or just received the contents of the pot. Adam, is it clear? Now, some of Rabbi Yosef Lamema. Now we're going to get into salt. What category is salt? Is salt treated just like spices? Or is salt different than spices? So we have a lot of discussion about salt coming up. It's only a few more lines to the next Mishnah. So Rabbi Yosef Lamema, Melech Hari Ketavlin. He thought to say that salt is like spices. In what way? It's like a spice. That the Kli Rishon, if it goes into the Kli Rishon, it bashla, it will cook. Good morning, Morris. Welcome to town. If you put it into the Kli Rishon, you put the spice into the pot that's off the fire, meaning he's going with the Tanakama. What did the Tanakama say? The first opinion of the Mishnah, Kama means first. Tana is the rabbi who taught in the Mishnah. So sometimes you have a Tana in the Breita. But Tanakama of the Mishnah, the first opinion of the Mishnah says, if you have a pot, you took off the fire, It's still boiling hot. You can't put spices into that pot. That's the Tanakama. You can't put spices. But if you poured the contents of the pot into a bowl, then you could put spices into that bowl. And if you want to mention to the group that we're on, a little reminder, right? So Rabbi Yosef said salt is the same law. You could put salt into the bowl once you pour the contents of the pot into a bowl, into a klisheni. He said he thought you could put the salt in there, but you can't put the salt into the original pot that you cooked the food in, even though it's off the fire, it's on the counter, but since it's the clearly shown, it's the first pot, you can't put spices into that pot. And you can't put salt into that pot. So that's what he was thinking. Omalei Abaye. Abaye says back to Rabbi Yosef, Kach, Tani Rav Chia. Rav Chia said over in a Braita, learned in a Braita, Melech eina ketavlin. Salt is not like spices. It's more strict than spices. Salt, maybe you want to say, absorbs very easily, and therefore it will be absorbed very easily in the klisheni. It will cook very fast in that second utensil. The bekli sheni nami bashla. It will also cook in a second vessel. See, here we have this phenomenon that there might be foods that could cook in a second vessel, in the kli sheni. Therefore, we require kli shlishi by many foods. And Abaye tells him, salt is one of those things that, according to Abaye understanding, it's called kalei habishul. It's easy to be cooked. And if it's easy to be cooked, you cannot put it in a kli sheni. You can't put it into a second vessel. You must put it into a kli shlishi. You would have to use a third utensil. Upliga de Rav Nachman. And it argues on Rav Nachman. This statement that Rav Nachman argues on the first two opinions that we have. The Omar Rav Nachman. So far we have two opinions. One opinion is that salt is treated like a spice. And kli sheni, if it's in a second utensil, it will be no problem to put the salt in, but you can't put it into the first utensil. The next opinion is more strict. Not only you cannot even put it into a second utensil, the salt. Comes a third opinion that says, the Amar of Nachman, that you could even put it into the first utensil. That salt requires a lot of cooking. It's a flavoring, it's like a spice, and it's even more stronger. We use salt to draw out the blood of the chicken, to draw out the blood of the meat. When we say koshering, kosher meat and kosher chicken costs much more money than not kosher. One of the reasons, besides the fact you have the ritual slaughter of the chicken and the ritual slaughter of the meat, meaning it has to be done shchita, has to be done a certain way of slaughtering, is that there's the processing after you slaughter the animal or the chicken. You take a pail of water and you soak the custom by the Ashkenazim, I presume the Sfaradim the same thing, is they soak it for a half hour. They soak it for a half hour in the pail of water. It's totally immersed in the pail of water. And as a result of that, the blood comes out, pulls out the blood. Also, you keep it in salt for an hour. So you soak it, you salt it, and maybe I'm suggesting the fact that salt is powerful to draw out blood. Maybe he holds that it requires, it's a very strong item. So if you want to cook that salt, it requires more. And he holds sricha, the Omer of Nachman, sricha milcha bishula kevisa Torah. Salt needs a lot of cooking, just like the meat of an ox. An ox meat most probably is tough, right, Mom? You got to tell me, right? Is that correct? It's not like, I presume, cow's meat, right? The ox is known as a strong animal, right? Kiga shor. The Torah talks about the goring of an animal, the ox gored. It's a powerful animal. Powerful animal. Its meat is tough, and it needs and it needs a lot of cooking to really cook meat. You need a lot to cook the meat. It takes a long time to cook meat. So the meat of an ox. So he says that salt requires that amount. And therefore, according to Rav Nachman, it would come out, you'd be allowed to put salt into a pot as long as it's not the original pot that it was, as long as, even in the original pot, as long as it's off the fire. And the Gemara says, others have a different text. They have Sava Rav Yosef Lamema. Rav Yosef thought to say, he originally thought to say, Melech Harehu Kitavlin. Salt is like spices. The Bekli Rishon Bashla. If you put the salt into the original pot that was cooked and it's off the fire, it would cook. And Kli Sheni Lo Bashla. But if you put the salt in a second utensil, not the original pot, you pour the pots of the pot into a bowl, then you can put the salt in. That's similar to what we had the text before. But the response of Abaye is different. Omale Abaye. Abaye says, Tony Rav Chia. Rav Chia says, Melach eina ketavlin. Melach, salt, is not like spices. That the Kli Rishon, Nami Lo Bashla. In a Kli Rishon, it does not cook. Meaning to say, the only difference, it's saying the same thing as the first text that we have. But what we have here is that the language of Abaye what he says, melach is not like salt, it's not like spices. To be kli rishon, that in a kli rishon, nami lo bashla, it does not cook in the original pot. V'hainu d'omer Rav Nachman, and that's what Rav Nachman said. It means you could put the salt into the pot that's off the fire, that's still boiling. V'hainu d'omer Rav Nachman, and that's what Rav Nachman said. Sricha milcha bishula kebisa de Torah. That the salt needs cooking like the meat of the ox. So what is let's analyze the difference of the text of these two gersot. The first text had Rav Yosef saying that salt is like spices, right? That salt is like spices, that it will cook in a kli rishon, in the first utensil will cook, and the second utensil will not cook. So now what's the difference? Here, the first text of Abaye said that salt is not like spices, Salt is not like spices. It will cook in the second utensil, right? So the first text, we have Abaye reporting in the name. So there's a major difference between the first text and the second text. Because the first text stated that salt is not like spices, that it will cook in, it's easy to cook salt. It will cook in a second vessel. The second text that states that Abaye says in the name of Rav Chia that salt is not like spices, that it will not cook even in a kli rishon. So it won't even cook in the first utensil. Let's get it straight. There's a lot going on. Is Abaye agreeing to Rav Nachman, or is Abaye disagreeing to Rav Nachman? The first statement, the first text we had, is that Abaye is arguing on Rav Nachman. Abaye is saying salt is more strict. We're more strict by salt. If we're more strict by salt, what does that mean? It will. If we're more strict by salt and spices, it will actually cook in a second vessel. Right? The Gemara never said anything could cook in a third vessel. The Gemara never said that. The whole question is about salt, meaning for sure you can put salt, let's say, in a third vessel. Can you put salt in the kli sheni? So Abaye said, the Rav Chia said, you can't even put salt in the second vessel. Why not? Because salt is easy to cook. That is the text of the first text. That Rav Chia says you can't put salt in a kli sheni. The other text has it the other way around. That he actually says salt is not more stricter. It's not easy to cook. Rather, it's hard to cook salt. And therefore, if it's hard to cook salt, you could even put it in the kli rishon, the first utensil, provided that it's not on the fire. Total opposites in the text and what he said. Now, and that ends, and that's why he says, "V'hainu d'Omer Nachman, sricha milcha b'shula kivisa the Torah." And if that's the text of Rav Chia, that salt is more lenient, then he's in sync. He's following Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said that salt requires a lot of cooking, like meat of an ox. Now, there's a big discussion. What is the law? What is the halacha? What does the halacha follow? Do we consider salt to be, are we going to be strict by salt and say we can't put salt in a second vessel because salt is easy to cook? Or could you even put salt in the first vessel as long as it's off the fire, because salt is hard to cook like meat? That is going to be a halachic question. We have two different opinions in the Gemara in what Rav Chia said. And so the Shulchan Aruch goes with the opinion salt does not even cook in the first vessel, in the original pot, as long as it's off the fire. Like the opinion of Rav Nachman, and like the second text in Rav Chia. Now that would be the Smarty opinion, according to, it would seem, from the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch. But the Ashkenaz rabbi, the Ramah, he writes that the one who is strict, like the opinion that salt cooks even in a second utensil, and therefore he would not put salt in the second utensil, Tovu alav bracha, will come upon the person blessing for being strict and not putting salt in a second utensil. Rather, wait for a kli shlishi. Now, this is all talking about salt that you got from the ground and was not cooked. But salt that was made from water, salty water that you cooked, then you will not have the stringency of saying that you can't put it into a kli. And even to a kli rishon, once it's off the fire, it would seem it would technically be allowed to be put into. Nevertheless, you cannot place the salt into even though the salt is cooked. And what's our salt today? Presume our salt is cooked. What do you think? Is our salt raw or not? Different types of salt. So you have to know what type of salt. What is the common salt that we use?
Yeah, I should know more about where this stuff comes from.
Right? What is the salt that we use? See, he says, because is it cooked or not cooked? Once it's cooked, we say there's no cooking after cooking. No cooking after cooking, but you can't put it on into the pot that's on the fire that looks like cooking. You don't put anything in the pot that's on the fire. But if it's off the fire, technically you're not cooking the salt because it's been already cooked, and it's a solid. It's not a liquid, right? We said by a liquid, once it's cooked and it cools down, it's subject to cooking again. But we said therefore you would not be able to put a liquid that was once cooked into a pot that's off the fire that's boiling hot.
So, do we have a definition of what's cooking? Because I feel like it seems like it's like we're kind of the Gemara is kind of defining it in the context like this is cooking, this isn't.
Right. So until now, what we've done is we said if you put your finger there and you can't keep your finger there, that means it's still that food is still hot enough to cook.
Right, but the idea that different foods like would cook more or less easily at the same temperature seems to imply that there's like a definition of cooking other than just how hot the.
Right. Right. That's a very good point. Meaning there is two things going on. There is in order for it to possibly cook, to have a possible problem is that the item that you're putting the raw food into, that item that's receiving the raw food, if your finger doesn't recoil, then you know it's not cooking. If now your finger recoils, not necessarily now we have a question. It could have not cooked the next item that you're putting into it. Exactly.
It seems to be based on like the rabbi's analysis of what's the chemical reaction. Like
Right. They seem like how the rabbis understand whether this food that you're putting into is this food easy to be cooked, meaning not all foods are the same, and there'll be certain foods that you put in now. Certain foods that you put into this item, it would cook, and certain foods won't cook. Meaning, you could have, according to the Shulchan Aruch, if the pot is off the fire, it's a big leniency. You could actually put salt into that pot because he's holding that even raw salt, because he's saying raw salt won't cook if the pot is off the fire. So if you place the raw salt into that pot, it won't cook. Others have the other opinion that say it will even cook even if you put pour the contents into a bowl. If you put the salt into that bowl, it would cook. So but it's rare that they're arguing of the question is what happens? Why isn't it shouldn't it be more obvious? Does it cook or doesn't it cook? It seems whatever improvement most probably it has to the salt, is that considered? Would you consider that like it's cooked? That the cooked salt has been cooked, or that improvement is not significant enough that it's called cooking? So the so what we're saying, even if the salt was once cooked, so even if our salt is cooked salt, you can't put it on the pot that's on the fire But it's also good from putting it into, the Chafetz Chaim says, even to put it into the original pot when it's off the fire, don't even put it into that pot, even though the salt has already been cooked.
That's because of the way it looks.
I presume the problem is maybe it's looking like you're cooking because you're putting it into, right? You're saying, because technically it shouldn't be cooking because it's already been cooked, right? If it's not cooking, so what's the problem? Most probably, let's see, most probably because maybe, like you said, maybe it's looking like cooking. Shin Yud Ches Ayin Aleph. Shin Yud Ches Ayin Aleph. Shin Yud Ches Ayin Aleph. He says, salt that's made from water that you cook, there's no, and there's no cooking after cooking. Similarly, sugar, if it's cooked, however they make the sugar, if it's not just, it's not raw. And some are not happy to put into the original pot. Exactly what you said. Because the original pot, even though it's off the fire, but it looks like cooking. That's what the Sharat Tzion writes. And therefore, don't ever put, that would be the halacha according to this. Best is never to put food, even the food was already cooked, into the original pot that you took off the fire. If that pot is boiling still, if your hand recoils, even though this food that you want to put in there was already cooked, and there's no cooking after cooking, but the problem is, since it's the original pot, it looks like cooking. So if you want to put the food that was already cooked, always put that food into a kli sheni, into a second utensil. And then once you put it into a kli sheni, second utensil, then you are good.
So the cliche doesn't just solve the problem of cooling; it also solves the problem of making it look like you're not
Cooking, right?
That's also
Right. Excellent. Very good. Yes. And then we said, but see, when we said the things that are raw, Rabbi Feinstein said, Rabbi Feinstein says, don't even put into a klisheni. Stay away from klisheni. Always deal with what? Klishlishi, because there's only a few things that we know you could put into a klisheni. Always go for the cliche. Have a great day, everybody. It's getting clear, right, everybody?